Let's get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for being here. Apologies for being a couple minutes late. It's always wonderful to host these sessions and to be able to answer any questions you might have about the particular topic at hand. Today's topic is all about values, both individual and company values, and how we as leaders can really infuse diversity, equity, and inclusion concepts into those things. So I do have a presentation prepared for you. And I'm going to go ahead and put that up on the screen for you. And let's get started with a little introduction about me. So maybe you know who I am, maybe you don't. My name is Natalia Eileen, and I lead a company called CNetwork. We do wonderful work, if I do say so myself, with clients across sizes and across industries on all things diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I'll just go through a very quick summary of what that means, what that looks like, and then we can jump right into today's topic. So again, my name is Natalia Eileen. Hello, everyone. I am happy to be here because I've been working in diversity, equity, and inclusion for about 10, almost 11 years now, which is always fun to be able to say. And I previously worked at companies like Facebook, or now Meta, and Teacher America, and supported their diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. I also studied these topics formally. My undergraduate degree at NYU, as well as my MBA, included elements of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And this is something that I feel very passionately about and have for now quite a few years throughout my professional life. It's why I started CNetwork. We're a diversity, equity, and inclusion consulting firm. We support clients across industries and across sizes on all things DEI. And it has just been such a pleasure to grow a fabulous team. This is my team, and they are wonderful. They do great work in this space. And I get the pleasure of leading them and supporting them as we do great work for our clients. So that's enough bragging from me. If you want to learn more about us, you can go to cnetwork.com and check us out. So maybe when you think about values, you think about your individual values. And maybe here on this list of individual values, this is just a randomized list of values. Maybe you see some of the values that you hold dear for yourself as an individual. Maybe accountability speaks to you, maybe a creativity or freedom or leadership or resilience speak to you. Now, of course, when we're trying to build these values and take them into consideration regularly, some best practices might include considering taking stock of those individual values regularly, maybe quarterly, maybe annually, monthly. Of course, we might also be thinking about checking in with ourselves regularly to make sure we're operating in accordance with our values. I always suggest we do that as leaders more frequently than we figure out if our values are actually aligned with who we are and who we want to be. We check in with ourselves more regularly, hopefully, than that, maybe daily, maybe weekly. And then, of course, sharing our values with people we trust so that they can hold us accountable and act as partners in our journey. Maybe all of this sounds really obvious to you, but I want to make sure that we take on a bit of a diversity, equity, and inclusion bent when we think about this, because of course, as individuals, hopefully we're all seeking to build more inclusive, more equitable spaces that really value diversity and value belonging as a sense that we really want people to feel when they're working under our leadership or on our teams. So these kinds of practices that are often most related to just building your own value process can also be used when becoming a more inclusive leader, when inclusion and when equity become some of the values that you truly desire to live, then doing these things can be really helpful from that perspective as well. So considering taking stock of what it means to be an inclusive leader or what it means to really drive equity within your workplace. Really checking in with yourself. Am I doing this daily, weekly, regularly? Am I demonstrating that I am interested in inclusion? Was there a moment today when I may have excluded some people, or when I may have indicated through my actions that even though I say I want to be inclusive, or even though I say I want our space to be equitable, that process that I used actually wasn't very equitable, right? And then lastly, sharing those values with those you trust so they can hold you accountable. Inclusive leadership is often all about entrusting some people to hold you accountable to actually doing that thing. And that's entrusting those people that might be really close to you, as well as entrusting your team, saying, hey, this is something I care deeply about, and being vulnerable about opening yourself up to that feedback when they have it, if they have it. So just want to make sure that we frame a lot of this from that perspective. Oh, and I already see some great questions coming through, which is exciting. Please bring your questions on. I want to read them. I want to answer them. And then from a company perspective, maybe you're also thinking about this. I literally threw on a smattering of words that I often see as part of people's or companies' values. Maybe excellence, maybe community, maybe inclusion, maybe respect, achievement, loyalty. You probably have quite a few others that come to mind for you based on the organization you're coming from. And that's great. Values can be really helpful and really important when driving a company culture. There is research around how beneficial company values can be. And so when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion from an individual perspective, we can also extrapolate some of what we talked about then into this space, into this corporate organizational space. And that's my hope for us today, because I have here an image. I'm hoping it's not too blurry. I pulled it from one of the organizations called Leadership Lifeway that talks about this, but this is a famous image. It actually is from Edgar Sheen's work on company culture, which is quite established in this space. It speaks to how company values can be really important, but that, as you can see with this pyramid, stated values are not always indicative of the assumptions and actual values of an organization. And so what we as leaders or as people really attempting to drive inclusion or equity or all of the other values we say we want our companies to hold, we need to be thinking about those assumptions that people begin to pull together from some of the unsaid, invisible experiences that they might have, the unsaid and invisible messages they might be receiving from you as a leader, from their peers, or from the systems that exist within an organization. And that those assumptions are foundational because they can influence what actually is the truth for people, like that capital T truth. You can say whatever you want about the stated values, but if those invisible assumptions, those fundamental values, actual values are not aligned, then your values won't be as powerful. So when we think about wanting to build a space that is truly inclusive, truly equitable, that values diversity, that values belonging, it's one thing to say it, it's another thing to create those systems and experiences that drive home those true invisible messages that are aligned with those values. And then, of course, at the top, logos, language, any traditions that you might have, those are very visible. You can create those kinds of experiences for people to reinforce what you say are your values. All of this, sometimes people don't realize it, but they're all connected to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So that's what I really wanted to make sure we talked about today. Okay, I hope that all felt related to why you're here and useful in terms of how to think about this. Again, this particular framework comes from Edgar Sheen's work in the 1980s. He published this really great culture article that people still reference today with this framework. So I encourage you to take a listen or review that if you'd like. And now I have all of these wonderful questions. So let me stop sharing my screen and I'm going to dig right into answering them. Again, I encourage you to consider some of what we talked about together already, because I think I might be referring back to it quite a bit while I'm answering your questions. Okay, So are you saying DEI should be one of our company values, or we should be applying our existing values to DEI, or both? Okay. There are some organizations that don't have a value that is specifically diversity, equity, inclusion, or belonging. And they're doing a wonderful job of leveraging the values they do have to create that sense for their employees, to create a sense that is aligned with DEI or B, right? You don't necessarily have to have a value that is diversity, equity, or inclusion or belonging. You don't necessarily have to do that. However, we are seeing more organizations, particularly since mid 2020, when a lot of these conversations really began to get super loud in the corporate world. We are seeing a lot more organizations put one of those DEI or B into their values. In fact, inclusion is the one that we're seeing most often. Now, again, you don't need to do that in order to, meet the requirements necessary to have diversity, equity, and inclusion be incredibly highly visible and felt. Those assumptions, those like that bottom foundational pyramid that I was describing to you from Edgar Sheen's work is a great way to think about this, because sometimes other values have pieces of inclusion or pieces of equity, pieces of diversity or belonging that can easily be interpreted by your employees as kind of those underlying assumptions underneath them. As long as you're really thinking deeply about how you're creating that messaging around these topics, you don't have to have DEI or belonging be part of your values. However, I think more companies are doing it because they're seeing that it's a way to hold them accountable and a way to make sure that people recognize, number one, that they're serious about valuing those topics, diversity, equity, inclusion, or belonging. As I mentioned, inclusion is by far what we're seeing more companies use. And it also indicates to job seekers, especially in this very competitive market, it indicates to job seekers that it's a value of the company rather than a kind of an understated value. And we're seeing that job seekers care more and more deeply than ever about seeing that their company, the one that they work for, values DEI. I hope that answers your question. What is the difference between having DEI in your values versus having a distinct DEI statement or vision? I like that question. I always say everyone should have a diversity, equity, and inclusion statement or vision. Mission statement, vision, every company should have that somewhere publicly. If their leaders indeed value diversity, equity, and inclusion, then that is something that should be visibly accessible to public audiences. And having that is separate from having your values, right? You might also want inclusion as one of your values, as so many companies have added recently. You might also want equity as one of your values, for example, and that really helps the company recognize that this is something that you as a leader or that they should be embodying. And that's great. However, the mission statement is something that should act a bit as your North Star for where you're hoping your organization will go over the course of the next year, 3 years, 5 years, what your vision and desires are on the DEI front. That is what that should be. So you would want to think about these as rather separate. I like that question because people sometimes do have just one. And I think, again, you don't need DEI to be one of your values to successfully build in that messaging with another one of your values. It helps. But I think it's really nice to know when people are truly investing in that mission statement and that vision, and then committing to putting action behind that. That mission statement and vision is very, very important. Who should be involved in creating a company's DEI values? Leadership, HR, everyone? Is that practical? Well, there are company values that sometimes company leaders will decide to create on their own at their own discretion, the C-suite or a group that the maybe CEO or some measure of like the chief culture representatives are putting together this group to think through, ideate around values. Sometimes that's how organizations will come up with their values. However, if DEI is a value that you're adding to your company values, or if you as an organization have, as a leader, as an organization, have decided to create DEI specific values, then that's something that you can have a collective of people create for you or with you. It's something that I have seen DEI councils do with the permission and sponsorship of the company leaders. I have seen that happen, although you'll want to make sure that they get created, endorsed, and then truly circulated so that they don't just live within this DEI council or task force. You can operate that way. The one thing I will say is that even if, whether it's the DEI council or this group that the C-suite put together to make this group or to make this list of values, whoever created the list and whoever had it endorsed and supported by the senior leadership, you'll want to make sure that it is then enforced and something that people talk about across the entire organization. So when you ask who should be involved in creating the company's DEI values, we might say that the values can be created by these small groups, but that the socializing and the living of the values is something that should be done by everyone. And I want to, for the sake of this question, go back to that framework that is very famous for describing how company cultures are built and created, because this is one that can be really useful to you as you're thinking about this. The artifacts, for example, are something that team members across the organization, HR, anyone can create. Maybe there's a tradition that someone suggests that's really aligned with those values. Maybe there's a piece of language, like a saying or something that someone else creates, right? This living of these values is where there's a lot of leeway. And in order to ensure that the assumptions on the base of this pyramid actually support the values that your team created in their own little vacuum, you'll need this whole pyramid to work for you. I hope that's a helpful representation for you. Okay, next question. I really love this content. Can you tell? This is fun. I thank you for being here and asking these questions. When should I be referencing my values in my day-to-day? Okay, so this is something that I imagine you're speaking from the company perspective when you ask this question, but I'll answer both as an individual and as a company. Many individuals will consider putting together some sort of routine practice, right, as leaders with certain values. In fact, when we coach some leaders in inclusive leadership and we set certain goals together, we also try to encourage leaders to come up with a certain cadence for how they'll check in with themselves about how effective they've been in living in accordance with the values related to inclusion or diversity or equity. So you might want to put together some sort of checklist for yourself. It doesn't have to be complicated. Maybe like 2 questions at night as you're winding down. Did I act in accordance with the values that I've set forth for myself? What could I have done better? Something like that is really helpful. So that's on the individual side, and it's something that we often will talk to leaders about as we're coaching them. On the more company side of things, you'll want to really think about how you're engaging with your employees in terms of those artifacts, those very visible experiences, those traditions, that language. All of that can be incorporated into how we're talking about values from a DEI context. If we value inclusion, for example, where are we putting in clear instances where we are emphasizing inclusion? Are we taking the time maybe to have a conversation with our teams every month or every quarter to talk about whether or not there were instances where people felt less than included, and really have a frank conversation about that? That's an institutionalized artifact at the top of that pyramid that can be really useful to leverage. Doesn't necessarily need to happen daily, but as long as you're getting some of those visible reps in, whether that be through an image or through a saying or through an experience, that can be really useful in demonstrating that there's a clear desire to do something related to DEI and a clear desire to value DEI. Some of that then trickles down into the assumptions and the messaging. But you'll also want to make sure that on a day-to-day basis, you as a leader, as a culture maker within your organization, are demonstrating those messages in that silent, unspoken way, that you are moving forward in an attempt to show truly that you value diversity, equity, and inclusion through your actions and not just in what you say verbally, right? Okay, we have a few more questions coming through, so I'm going to try to speak faster or take less time on each question, but we'll see. Our current values are not really spoken about or leveraged beyond annual all hands meetings. Would adding a value about DEI really matter? This is exactly why I say that sometimes we see some organizations not add inclusion, DEI, or any of them to their list of values, and still they're really living out DEI. What matters more than anything is that the values are truly infused across the experience for all employees. That's what really matters. So we also see the opposite. We also do see organizations include that inclusion or that diversity or that equity. We'll see them include it, and it makes absolutely no difference. So what I say to you is, if currently your organization is not really leveraging those values, you'll want to make sure that you start incorporating areas within your organization to reference those regularly. Now, the easiest way to do that is to start with those artifacts, those highly visible artifacts. If we say that community is one of our values, what can we do to visibly reinforce that value? Okay, after you've gotten through some of the more visible ones, and you can maybe then do an audit of that assumptions bucket all the way on the bottom. That audit can really help you consider what ways, if any, is actually this organization signaling to companies the opposite of what we're saying that we actually want to see, right? So that's a really important question. You're right. Adding a value about DEI would not matter if you're not already infusing your organization with the values you have. So I encourage you to consider finding ways to do that now. Okay. Our values. Okay, I read that one already. We are a small, young firm and don't have broad, formalized values at our organization. Are those a prerequisite for doing any DEI related work? Oh, definitely not. If you're a young firm and you haven't formalized any values, you can still do DEI work. Certainly, values help inform often a lot of DEI activities, but it's never too early to start your diversity, equity, and inclusion journey. It's never too early to engage in a training. It's never too early to have conversations about important topics out in the world related to identity, for example. It's never too early to say how passionately and deeply you care and the organization cares about DEI. You can make that statement. The statement that we talked about earlier, that mission statement, that vision statement, get that written up, create that North Star, and then get to working on that. That's very separate from the values. And you can do that without values. I will also say that it's never too early to institutionalize values in an organization, especially if you think that it's possible. You can start creating some of those artifacts related to values to really drive and build an organization that has the sense and the feeling, the sentiment that hopefully you really want to create within your employee workforce. Everyone appreciates a little bit of those fun culture driving elements, right? Okay. Should we be making separate values for teams or offices, or is it more effective for those to be company-wide? Thank you for this question. This is something that especially large organizations wonder often. You can certainly have separate values that maybe are very specific to a particular division or to a particular team. It's not uncommon. In fact, sometimes it's a little easier to drive some of those sentiments across a smaller org, a smaller segment of the team. However, I think it's very important that there be some sort of connective tissue between those values and the broader values of a company or organization. That way, the sense of unity and the sense of connection that the values drive within the team, if the team has created values, that way that sense of unity and connection doesn't just sit with the team. And that way the members of that team feel connected to the broader company. We can see that sometimes when there are values related just to a particular team or a particular segment, we can see that that might drive a deeper sense of separation. It can drive more silos within workplaces. So if there is a desire to create some sense of culture within a team that's reliant on some specific values to that team, I would always say you'll want to make sure that there's a connection between those values and the larger values of the company. Otherwise, it can get a little tricky. How do I get senior leadership to align on how DEI interacts with our values? This is a tough one because there are certainly many different ways that leaders are the culture makers of an organization. And if they're not invested in creating values that are supportive of your DEI strategies, then that can be really tricky. I think what you could do is you could share with them all of the ways that DEI is in its own right incredibly valuable to any organization. There's a lot of data out there about how diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging each independently and collectively create a culture that is more collaborative, a workplace that is more productive, more innovative. There is data that truly supports that. And my hope for you is that in sharing those details, you can create a bit of a distinction between, these are values that the company aligns with, great, but we also need to prioritize DEI. And if we can do that in tandem, maybe we'll be stronger for it. But we definitely also need to make sure that we're emphasizing DEI. Right. And so those are the kinds of messages that I would be sharing with my leaders, especially some of those statistics. And if you have any indication right now that DE&I are lagging within your organization, maybe there's a survey with some results that indicate that certain members of your community are not feeling as seen and heard, or maybe you've heard anecdotally some things and can have that kind of written out in an objective way, collected somewhere. All of that can help maybe emphasize how important and passionately we all should be emphasizing DEI with our values and elsewhere. Okay, all right. How can we make the sharing of personal values a part of the daily flow of working together? Oh, I like this question. So this is something, the personal values question is something that I feel very passionately about, because I think if we can really sit with our personal values and check in with ourselves on our personal values, we can become a lot more effective at actually acting in accordance with those values. And that's where what I shared last in this other slide, which I'll share with you again, comes in, right? And so I appreciate this question because I think it's so important. Taking stock of our values regularly and then checking in with ourselves regularly is huge. However, that third bucket there on the bottom, sharing your values with those you trust so they can hold you accountable and act as partners in your journey, that's also huge. It's why I added it in there as a third element. And so if you're struggling to really encourage people to make sharing their personal values part of their daily flow, I would say that these three pieces are an important part of any effective value-driven leadership toolkit. You'll want to do each of these things regularly. And in fact, if you open your circle, the people, if you open the number of people that you're reaching out to as people who can hold you accountable, if you open up that circle to your team members and to your employees or to your peers, then you have more of an opportunity to share vulnerably with them. You know, it can be a beautiful way to create a sense of vulnerability that is contagious across your organization. I would say you can have specific times maybe within your organization's checkpoints, maybe your one-on-ones with managers, especially middle managers. You can emphasize the need to share some of those values and go back and forth on it. Leaders can share with their direct reports and direct reports can share with their leaders and also share how aligned they feel they've been lately in those values. That third piece is so critical. So I would say create some of those institutionalized instances when they can do that sharing, and then make sure that as you're messaging this, you're indicating that this is part of a continuum. You can't just take stock of your values, check in with yourself. You also need to make some measure of this public in order to make sure that you are on track and that other people know how to keep you on track. Thank you very much for that question. Okay, where do I start when it comes to creating values for myself as a leader? Okay, I like this question. Should they be the same as our company values or different? I think creating values for yourself as a leader is a very personal process. So I would say that there may be some company values that speak to you, that you feel deeply connected to. However, you should not feel obligated by any means to just keep those values for yourself. In fact, I would say start by looking at a list like this one on my slide. This list is a very short, brief list of curated values. There are so many online. Do a quick Google search, review all of the values you find, and write down the ones that resonate with you as a leader, especially since it seems you really want to create these values for yourself as a leader. So using that mindset and that framing, go ahead and review all of these options out there. You can Google it, you can review it, write a full list. It can be 20 values long. And then challenge yourself to take that list and whittle it down, because you don't want to have 20 values that you're trying to maintain on a daily basis or on a weekly basis. That can be really overwhelming. That's a sure recipe for ending this process too soon. Take that list of 20, see if you can challenge yourself to whittle it down to 10. And then from there, see if you could possibly pick out of those 10, the 5 to 7 that really, really speak to you as a leader, really, really speak to what you desire to be and who you desire to embody as a leader. Go through that process and see if it helps you to narrow that whole list down to some values that you feel just deeply connected to, that you can really get behind. You can do this process frequently. I would say don't do it every month or anything like that. Maybe every quarter. Some people do it annually, where they'll look at their list again and say, hey, are these 5 to 7 actually the ones that matter most to me, actually matter to the leader that I aspire to be? And taking that time to decide, okay, actually, I'm going to swap these couple out. And then, of course, following that process on a weekly basis or on a daily basis to check in with yourself and say, am I living in accordance with these values? Or what moments today did I fail a little at really living up to that? And those moments are okay, right? We're human. So you just take stock of that, check in with yourself, and then hopefully move forward while allowing others to hold you accountable. Okay. We had a whole DEI moment happen in 2020, which included creating a value we called diversity and inclusion. Yes, you were not alone. But I feel like now it's fallen off everybody's radar. How do you keep this stuff top of mind and not just let it fade into the background? Yeah, this is something that unfortunately we're also seeing quite a bit of. So we're seeing quite a few people or organizations create these values, maybe even create a mission statement, right? Which I've mentioned can be a real North Star and great way for people to hold themselves accountable to something. But maybe an organization created a value and maybe their values aren't generally something that they're thinking about in this kind of pyramid way that we were talking about earlier, with the artifacts really being something, with us stating over and over again that this is a value, and then making sure that there are assumptions and messages that are supporting these values effectively. If your organization isn't thinking holistically about its values, especially this one, then that can be really tricky. What you might want to do is start by creating some of those artifacts at the very top of the pyramid, some of those things that are very visible related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Maybe start a speaker series or something, bringing in people who can speak to what it's like to live and work in your industry as a woman or as a person of color or as a member of the LGBTQ plus community or what have you. Do something visible to really start creating those artifacts that demonstrate that there is a deep desire and interest in supporting that value and all values, right? That's where I would start. And if you don't have a mission statement or a team that is working toward diversity and inclusion, I would advocate for both of those things. So if you are, very much interested in pushing toward diversity, equity, and inclusion within your organization and feel that people aren't there yet, advocating for that mission statement, advocating for a strategy that might have a bit of a horizon, like a 1 to 3 to 5 year horizon, is a great place to start. Okay. People at my company assume that all things DEI live with HR. How do I convince someone in accounting that this matters in their work too? This is definitely a common question that I'm asked regularly. How do we make sure that everyone understands that this is their job? And I always think that there is a measure of messaging that those assumptions, once again, that we want to make sure get sent out to people to really, that they really feel it and understand it, that this is part of their work. That messaging needs to be part of what comes from the leadership. That messaging is what needs to come from those who they are listening to within the organization. So if you're seeking to convince the accounting team that this work matters to them too, you'll want to make sure that the leaders of the accounting team are saying that and are convinced of that. You'll want to make sure that the leaders above the accounting team and the other teams are saying that and encouraging that across the organization. Because unless that's something that's messaged from the top, it can be really difficult to convince others how important it is. You also might want to make this really tangible. One challenge we run into often as a team of diversity, equity, and inclusion consultants is that people are like, okay, we hear it, DEI, important, cool. What does that mean? What does that look like? How do I do that? And so there might be ways for you to emphasize what this could look like in practice for an individual. So maybe it means having conversations with people who are different from you on a regular basis. Maybe it means creating opportunities to build allies across identities within the workplace. Maybe it means for the accountant that they take some time to read about a particular issue or a particular experience of a community. Maybe it means that the accounting team gets a chance to look at how they can bring in a more diverse pipeline at the top of their recruitment funnel so that their accounting team is more diverse. What does this look like for them? Really painting that picture can be a powerful way to make sure that this is indeed a top priority. What can I do to get my colleagues to see the value here? I'm imagining lots of eye rolls or not this again attitudes. The value of DEI. Yeah, this is something, again, that we hear a lot. We do hear that there are concerns about people not recognizing how important diversity, equity, and inclusion is. And it takes some thick skin to be in this work, especially when the excitement and the energy around 2020 begins to dwindle, right? So my encouragement to you is to think of the different ways that people hear and receive compelling information. For some people, compelling information comes in the form of data. We talked earlier about how important it can be to offer statistics around the value of diversity, equity, and inclusion within a workplace. We talked about how there are studies that have indicated DEI and companies that value it can be life-changing for an organization. It can increase the likelihood of productivity. It can increase collaboration. It can increase innovation. It increases access to broader networks. There are so many ways that diversity, equity, and inclusion is. Companies that are valuing DEI are more profitable. There are statistics that can be really compelling. So I would start there. Some people, that really speaks to them. For other people, speaking of profitability, for other people, the bottom line is what's most important. So not just statistics that are generally like, oh yeah, more innovative, all of that. For some people, the bottom line is what really speaks to them. So how will this turn into the higher profitability, digging into some of the ways that companies have seen that happen, and then sharing that with your team leaders can be really powerful. We know, for example, that DEI and investment in DEI can reduce retention. And right now, if you ask any organization, they'll tell you that looking for talent is super expensive. So if you retain more of your talent, you're saving tons of money. Creating those connections for leaders can be really powerful so that they can see the value in this work. Last thing I'll say, we talked about data. We talked about that money, the bottom line. And then the third thing is some people, these topics really resonate with them if they hear stories and can understand truthfully how people are impacted by this work, both positively when DEI efforts exist and negatively when they don't exist. Some people really appreciate learning more about the individuals, particularly how in many corporate spaces, those who are underrepresented are experiencing higher rates of burnout. Hearing someone's story in that space, in that regard, can be really powerful for some people. Hearing about the instances of microaggressions or the instances of indirect discrimination, people of color or people who are members of the LGBTQ+ community endure, hearing those stories can be really powerful and compelling for certain people. So if you can find ways to get those stories out there, to share articles and news clippings, to get your colleagues to share maybe anonymously some of the instances that they felt they were less than included in a space, or where someone made an assumption about them and it impacted them personally. All of those strategies can be really powerful when instilling this sense of, this is very important. Please pay attention. Okay, that was my last question. If you have any other questions, please be sure to put them in. Otherwise, I'm going to go ahead and share quickly that you can reach us. You can find us anytime at CNetwork. We have all of the social media set up for you. So you can find us on Twitter, on Instagram, on YouTube, on LinkedIn. We also are, we have a newsletter that you can sign up for at any time. And if you're interested in working with us personally, please do sign up with us, cnetwork.com/consultation. We're here for you, excited as always to connect and to hear more about what you need to bring your DEI to the next level. We also have several courses that you can go online and take yourself. You can go to courses.cnetwork.com to take those courses at any time. We have a couple, including those about ERGs and about reducing bias in the workplace. Let me go ahead and share my screen so that I can share with you what that could look like for you. And then we are here for you for these kinds of sessions. We really love having these sessions. So feel free to follow us to make sure that you know where to find us next time. And again, if you do want to schedule a consultation, you can do so at cnetwork.com/consultation. All right. Well, with that, I think we might be able to end 10 minutes early unless any last minute questions come through the Q&A box. Nope. Thank you so much for joining. Always appreciate having you here. Bye, everyone.